Hey guys, as some of you might remember, a while back I made this whole hour-long video essay about how the themes of the original cycle of kaiju films from the 50s through the 70s reappeared in the current cycle of American kaiju films. It was a lot of work, but I had a lot of fun with it. I'm really enjoying the explosion of the video essay format over the last several years, especially the ones about movies. Lindsay Ellis, Patrick H. Willems, Red Letter Media, and Renegade Cut are all worth checking out, among others. And my family, friends, and anyone who's ever let me get started on kaiju movies can tell you that I'll gladly talk your ear off about those anytime given the chance. So I figured I'd keep making more of these videos, shorter, more focused, and with a little less academic rigor, but similar kinds of analysis. So my last video was in part about the whole resurgence of kaiju-based movies in America, but that's really only part of the picture. The whole genre went through kind of a dry spell after Godzilla's 50th anniversary film, Godzilla Final Wars, with the only really big things released between then and Pacific Rim being Gamera the Brave and Cloverfield, but nowadays we're in what some fans are calling a kind of Kaiju Renaissance, with the genre getting more mainstream attention and more kaiju media coming out both in the US and Japan. The event that signaled this to most people, I think, was Toho's announcement in the wake of the 2014 Godzilla's worldwide success that the Japanese series would be revived with a new film directed by genre veteran Shinji Higuchi and famed auteur Hideaki Anno. This movie, Shin Godzilla, was a huge deal. The 2014 Godzilla brought a lot of new fans to the series, but I think Shin Godzilla might have generated even more hype among existing fans. Part of it I would attribute to shifting demographics among Godzilla fans in my own age range. I've been active in fan circles and online forums for nearly 10 years, and around 2010 I'd say the character of the Godzilla fandom in general was mostly along the lines of Western geek culture in general. In recent years, though, I've noticed a lot more overlap with otaku and anime fans, people who are into Japanese pop culture in general. Given that shift, one understands why Hideaki Anno's name being attached to Shin Godzilla made people lose their minds. Anno is, of course, most famous for creating the influential and wildly successful anime series Neon Genesis Evangelion, which is one of the greatest things human beings have ever created. I've heard its cultural significance in Japan compared to that of Star Wars in the West, and if that's the case, I can see why. It's a masterful, striking, thoughtful, and cryptic work whose themes, details, and meaning are hotly debated by fans well over 20 years after its original release. And of course the hype among other fans needs little explanation. The Japanese Godzilla series was back, co-directed by Shinji Higuchi, who directed the special effects for Shusuke Kaneko's acclaimed Gamera trilogy in the 90s. The film finally came out in the US in October 2016, and was well received by critics and most of the younger fan base. Most of it. However, the film was considerably less popular with a group of fans we young folks tend to call the Old Guard. The Old Guard mostly refers to a small circle of older scholar fans, people who've published books on kaiju and tokusatsu media and tend to be tapped pretty frequently for audio commentaries and liner notes for home video releases. People like August Ragone, David Callett, Steve Reifel, Ed Godzacheski, and so on. Obviously, these guys have all made immeasurably valuable contributions to the critical and scholarly discourse surrounding these films, and most of us probably owe a lot of what we know about these films and the filmmakers behind them to the Old Guard. That said, for the most part, they seem to pretty unanimously dislike Shin Godzilla, and a lot of them cited one ideological objection in particular, namely the idea that Shin Godzilla is a nationalistic, right-wing betrayal of the series' roots. Now, to be fair, it's not as if they're projecting something onto the film that absolutely isn't there. Shin Godzilla is a harsh critique of Japan's status following World War II, especially its relationship with the United States, as well as the Japanese government's hesitance in the face of disaster and its cumbersome bureaucracy. In the film, the government spends time in meeting after meeting debating the exact nature of what they're up against, and once Godzilla comes ashore, they spend more time debating the constitutional grounds for deploying the military against it. By the time the military arrives, Godzilla has evolved into a new form, and used so much energy in the process that it escapes back to the sea to recuperate while the military's attack is held up by civilians in the line of fire. In the second half of the film, after Godzilla's second emergence and the death of the entire cabinet, the US government tries to take control of the situation from Japan and proceed with a plan to nuke Godzilla where it stands in the middle of Tokyo. They're represented to the Japanese government by a special presidential envoy, Japanese-American Kyoko Ann Patterson, whose internal conflict over the bombing leads her to take the side of a ragtag government task force rallying the support of Japan's military and private sector to incapacitate Godzilla by stopping its body's cooling mechanism and forcing its nuclear metabolism to shut down. Now, it's easy enough to see where one could read nationalism into that, and if I'm being honest, I do think some fans around my own age have been a bit too quick to dismiss that idea. I do, however, think that this aspect of the film has been blown somewhat out of proportion. What it comes down to for me is this: the blanket use of the term nationalism kind of obscures the context of the phenomenon one uses it to describe, as if all nations exist on a level playing field. I'm inclined to draw a pretty sharp distinction between the nationalism of a country aggressively expanding to conquer and subjugate others, and that of a country struggling to free itself from colonial rule or economic dominance by another. Context matters, but where does that leave Japan? Japan is a country that committed all manner of atrocities against China, Korea, the Philippines, and other countries in the first half of the 20th century, and has been reluctant to discuss or own up to them ever since. It's also a country that endured the wholesale destruction of major cities and massacres of civilians by the US military even as it was on the brink of surrender, followed by nearly a decade of what amounted to US military rule, and still has US military bases on its soil to this day. It's a bit of an odd situation. At different points in recent history, it's occupied both of the positions I mentioned before, heading up a brutal empire and being subject to mass murder and occupation by a foreign power, as part of a larger effort at setting up puppet states to maintain an edge against a rival power. In that case, I'd say a closer examination of this apparent nationalist subtext's intent and direction is called for. Looking at the arguments the film actually seems to be making, I'd say the politics are a little dubious in some respects, but I find little fault with its main thesis. Basically that the US doesn't really have Japan's best interests at heart, and Japan should try to step out from under the US's thumb and look after itself. No imperial nostalgia, no appeals to Yamato Damashi, no calls for more aggressive stance towards other Asian powers, more or less just making the case for self-determination and independence from the US. I have to admit, considering how things tend to go when America shows up in a country to save it from terrorists or communists or kaiju,
if Godzilla reappears in Japan, or in Japan's coastal waters, you must agree to let us use nuclear weapons.
Shin Godzilla kind of has a point there. In the interest of fairness to the people I'm contradicting here, though, there are a couple of relevant points I found questionable. First of all, there's the film's single explicit reference to the Imperial period, in which the film's protagonist, a young official named Yaguchi, calls out one of his elders in the cabinet for not taking the situation seriously.
これで一安心だな。どうでかくても生き物だ。自衛隊の武器で殺処分できるだろう。ああ、奴の死骸を利用した復興財源案を考えてみるか。
大臣、先の戦争では旧日本軍の希望的観測、机上の空論、こうあってほしいという発想などにしがみついたがために国民に300万人以上もの犠牲者が出ています。根拠のない楽観は禁物です。
I feel like there are entire countries that might not regard the most tragic aspect of the Japanese Empire to be the Japanese who died under it, but the immediate situation in this scene does affect Japan first and foremost, and the scene is too fleeting to really read too much into. Second, there's a scene in which two characters meet in the Showa Commemorative Park in Tachikawa. The Showa period refers to the 1926 to 1989 reign of Emperor Hirohito, revered among Japanese nationalists as the divine figurehead of the imperial cult during the last days of the Japanese Empire. However, it's not clear whether the location has any symbolic significance, and in the context of the story, a large public park near the provisional government headquarters in Tachikawa and adjacent to a self-defense force base makes sense as a location for the Godzilla Countermeasure Task Force to make discreet contact with informants. Again, there's too little information to say for certain whether the scene is some kind of right-wing dog whistle. There's also Anno's previous work to consider. For instance, all of the surnames of Evangelion's main cast are taken from Imperial Japanese warships, which probably has something to do with what's often characterized as Anno's fetish for military equipment. Notably, almost every piece of military hardware in Shin Godzilla is named on screen, along with most characters and locations. I won't deny that he's got something of a fixation, but it really seems like more of a fascination with machinery in general, including urban infrastructure. There's also the short film Aikoku Sentai Dai Nippon, or Patriotic Squadron Great Japan, a Super Sentai parody produced by Gainac's predecessor Daikon Film. In the film, a team of superheroes, Ai Kamikaze, Ai Harikiri, Ai Geisha, Ai Sukiyaki, and Ai Tempura, fight Soviet-inspired villains in a broad satire of the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. Though the short's comedic intent makes it difficult to determine the sincerity of its nationalist overtones, it is an interesting case, albeit one in which Anno's personal involvement was limited to providing narration and appearing in costume as a giant robot. All this is debatable and kind of falls in a gray area, but there are other points brought up by those who claim Shin Godzilla is a staunchly nationalist film that I find considerably less credible. A few of these were presented in a panel on the subject hosted by Steve Reifel and Ed Godzacheski at G-Fest 25 this past July. One of these was the frequent appearances of the Japanese flag in various offices and locations throughout the film. I believe the specific comparison drawn was between the ubiquitous flags in the film and the prominent placement of the flag at rallies held by the Nippon Kaigi, a nationalist right-wing organization that openly promotes pro-Japanese revisionist history. It's an interesting point, but not that strongly supported. Much, if not most, of the film takes place in government buildings, and while I've never been inside any Japanese government buildings, I could easily see this being a true-to-life depiction, considering the beliefs of the dominant Liberal Democratic Party and Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who actually serves as an advisor to the Nippon Kaigi members in the Diet. A similar argument can be made about the use of the Rising Sun flag on military officers' uniforms. While the Rising Sun design is strongly associated with the Japanese Empire outside of Japan, especially in former Japanese territories in Asia, its connotations in Japan are less specific. This probably has something to do with the design predating the Empire considerably, comparable to the relationship between the Iron Cross and Nazi Germany, and also with Japan's general reluctance to really confront the atrocities of the Empire. As a result, the design and variations on it are used by self-defense forces in various capacities to this day, though a quick Google search fails to turn up the specific usage featured in the film, with some results featuring the more common, less controversial Hinomaru national flag design. In any case, the use of both flags in Shin Godzilla, while reflective of real trends and phenomena that are absolutely valid causes for concern or debate, doesn't really make the case for the film being a reactionary screed in disguise. There was also something about the Japanese flag appearing behind Kyoko's head during her first scene, which was interpreted as being an instance of a visual trope depicting what someone is thinking about, the implication being that this is Kyoko already being drawn towards allegiance to or sympathy for Japan. As carefully composed as Anno's shots are, I still think this is more or less a coincidence. At this point in the film, Kyoko is acting in a pretty straightforward manner as a representative of the US president, and continues to do so for a while after this. Her shift to aiding Yaguchi and his team despite the president's decisions is gradual, and the tipping point comes much later in the film. If the position of the flag was meant to be symbolic, deliberately employing such a composition here would undermine Kyoko's character development and weaken her overall arc. So, to summarize, while Shin Godzilla could certainly be characterized as patriotic and playing on national pride to support its message, I think calling it nationalistic in the style of the Japanese Empire is at best an exaggeration. Could you argue that Anno could be a bit of a right-winger? Sure, he might be. Could you be concerned about this film coinciding with a real-life resurgence of reactionary Japanese nationalism and militarism that includes no less than Japan's prime minister, who denies sexual slavery and imperial comfort stations and also loved this movie? Absolutely, I find that worrisome myself, but I don't think the actual substance of Shin Godzilla's message provides any kind of active support for those things. It seems mostly concerned with Japan stepping out of the shadow of a country that massacred its people and subsequently stunted its sovereignty. With all that said though, I don't mean to suggest that the resurgent nationalist movement in Japan isn't real or doesn't warrant concern, and I don't blame Reifel, Godzacheski, or anyone else for being wary of themes that coincide with the views or aims of that movement in popular media. I don't think Shin Godzilla is an expression of imperial nostalgia or that it promotes a right-wing revisionist agenda, but there absolutely are films that do so, and I stumbled across one, ironically, not long after attending Steve and Ed's G-Fest panel. Being something of a collector, there are some movies I buy not because I've seen them before or because I know I'll probably like them, but because of relevance to something I'm devoted to and kind of a completionism. This leads to plenty of blind buys. Sometimes this works out well. At G-Fest 24 in 2017, I bought the animated spin-off of the 1998 Godzilla movie, which was great fun, and Bong Joon-ho's The Host, which was brilliant. This past year I grabbed Q the Winged Serpent, which was a really neat movie, and the live-action Space Battleship Yamato movie from 2010, which I knew was kind of a gamble, but which I didn't expect to be as bad a time as it was. Space Battleship Yamato is based on an extremely popular anime series from the 70s, which I haven't seen, about a spaceship constructed from the remains of the Imperial Japanese battleship Yamato that embarks for the planet Iskandar in search of a device that can restore the Earth's ecosystem, ravaged by radioactive attacks by the Gamilus aliens. Considering the origins of the ship, the anime inevitably came up during the panel as an example of Imperial nationalism appearing in pop culture. However, I'd read that the anime was informed by the extremely contradictory ideas of two of its creators. One, Leiju Matsumoto, had an interest in Japanese history and folklore, but a deep contempt for early Showa militarism, while the other, Toshinobu Nishizaki, was far more of a right-winger and was attracted to the concept as a vehicle for inspiring patriotism. I'd also seen the ship and its mission interpreted as a metaphor for post-war Japan using the power and industry built up during the imperial period for more peaceful and constructive purposes. With all that in mind, I was curious about what the live-action movie would be like. The plot of the movie mostly follows that of the anime. Facing military defeat and ecological devastation by the Gamilas, Earth revives the Yamato as a spaceship and sends it in search of the planet Iskandar and an anti-radiation technology. It's a pretty well-made and entertaining space opera, with some really compelling character drama and amazing costume design. Seriously, its vision of military dress in the 22nd century is a mix of old sailor uniforms and sick leather jackets. But when you start looking at the themes and ideology, it gets pretty ugly. First off, the whole film seems to really revere military culture. There are a lot of scenes focusing on a glorified military rapport between naval crews and fighter pilots, and protagonist Kodai's arc isn't just about becoming a leader, but taking on the responsibilities of an officer, with a number of scenes between him and the ailing Captain Okita focusing on this theme in particular. And then, right as the Yamato is approaching Iskandar, as the crew prepares to break through a Gamilus blockade and land on the planet, Kodai makes this speech.
これが14万8000光年の長い旅の最後の戦いになるだろう。1945年4月、戦艦ヤマトは絶望の中に残されたほんのわずかな希望のために出撃した。今回も同じだ。送られてきた座標はガミラスの罠かもしれない。これから行う作戦は敵の思う壺なのかもしれない。しかしそれが暗闇の中のわずかな光だとしても、少しでも可能性があるならば、我々は前に進まなければならない。それがこのヤマトという船の宿命なんだ。そしてそれが我々に与えられた任務なんだ。どうかみんなこのことだけは忘れないでほしい。
There's kind of a lot to unpack here, but let's start with the reference to the significance of the name Yamato. Yamato is the name of the ethnic majority in Japan, the dynasty formed by the Japanese monarchy, and the historical province in which the former originally settled and the latter originated. It has powerful connotations tying it to the history of the Japanese as a people, and is therefore a popular term among Japanese nationalists, seeing prominent usage during the imperial period. Yamato Damashi was used to refer to the Japanese national spirit, and the Yamato class of battleships, including the Yamato itself, was created specifically to allow Japan to compete with other naval powers in the expansion of its empire. You see why associating the idea of any ship named Yamato with hope is a bit questionable. Let's also consider what the mission Kodai referenced actually consisted of. In April 1945, the Yamato was sent on what amounted to a suicide mission in order to slow down the Allied naval forces approaching Japan. It was to sail to Okinawa, beach itself, and then keep firing on the approaching Allied forces until it was itself destroyed, delaying the capture of the island as long as possible. This is what Kodai calls a ray of hope in a time of despair, a suicide attack ordered by a crumbling empire to stall for time, and a failed one at that. The Yamato was sunk long before it could reach Okinawa. Failure or not, though, that's what this movie considers heroism, which is illustrated disturbingly in the final scene. At the end of the film, after destroying most of the Gamulus forces on Iskandar, the Yamato returns to Earth and is ambushed by a remaining Gamulus ship, which disables its weapons and announces its intention to wipe out what's left of humanity. Kodai then orders the rest of the crew to abandon ship, then destroys the Gamulus craft by piloting the Yamato straight into it. Just to recap, this is a movie that glorifies military culture and camaraderie, regards the suicidal desperation of the declining Japanese empire as heroic, and culminates in a perfectly literal kamikaze attack. It's probably worth noting that the film wasn't exactly bound to this ending by the source material either. The suicide attack is actually taken from a follow-up film to the original series entitled Farewell to Space Battleship Yamato, which follows the conclusion of the original Gamulus Iskandar arc and ends with Kodai crashing the Yamato into a ship belonging to the Comet Empire. Leiji Matsumoto refused to work on the film's ending, and it proved so controversial with audiences that a second season of the TV series was produced retelling the story with a different ending. The live-action movie had options, both in terms of ideological subtext and the ending, and chose the more militaristic approach, down to using the more Neo-Bushido option out of the two possible endings from a different story arc from the one it was nominally adapting. So, what should we take away from all this? In short, yes, there's a resurgence of reactionary nationalism and an effort to rehabilitate the image of the early Showa Empire in Japan. Yes, this is cause for concern, especially when the Prime Minister and many of his party have ties to the proto-fascist Nippon Kaigi. Yes, these ideals are reflected with sometimes alarming bluntness in Japanese pop culture and media, from the revived Showa militarism of Space Battleship Yamato, to the veiled national chauvinism of Axis powers Hetalia, to the coded imperial nostalgia of Attack on Titan. No, I don't think that's really what is going on in Shin Godzilla. It coincides in certain respects with the resurgent Japanese nationalism, which seizes upon the same grievances to create a simplistic image of victimhood for Imperial Japan, but it is at best a serious error to swing to the other extreme and universally justify all actions taken against Japan by the United States. Atrocities like the practice of sexual slavery and comfort stations throughout the Japanese Empire do not justify or erase the widespread rape of Japanese women by American occupation forces, either among the general population or in the system of licensed brothels established as a preventative measure, nor do the massacres of civilians in Korea or Manchuria justify those perpetrated in Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. War, especially between empires or neo-colonial powers, creates complex political situations, especially with regard to the treatment of civilian citizens of each side by the other. Refusal to acknowledge the nuances of such situations by one side gives ammunition to factions within the other aiming to do just the opposite. This is pretty lofty and serious stuff to be discussing in relation to what amounts to a summer blockbuster, but it seems irresponsible to characterize the legitimate grievances aired in Shin Godzilla solely as the domain of reactionary nationalists. It runs the risk of making those nationalists appear more sympathetic to others who share those grievances, and attracting those people to the rehabilitation and restoration of the pre-war order. This is what fascists and reactionaries do. They seize upon and exploit legitimate injustice that is ignored, denied, or upheld by its perpetrators, and direct popular discontent over said injustice against their own enemies by blaming them for it. Now, I don't think a few Western authors and scholars taking issue with a monster movie is going to play a pivotal role in the outcome of major political movements in Japan, but it is indicative of broader attitudes and tendencies that extend beyond the topic at hand, and a reluctance to acknowledge America's war crimes and abuses of the Japanese people when these issues are raised without extensive disclaimers, appealing to the pacifism written into Japan's post-war constitution by the US. These attitudes in some respects constitute the inverse equivalent of what they're objecting to and could have serious consequences, but as for the subject of this video, Shin Godzilla isn't a revival of the Imperial spirit, guys. It's a damn good monster movie that carries on the series' tradition of examining the legacy of World War II in Japan, while also commenting on more contemporary issues like the government's response to the aftermath of the 2011 earthquake and tsunami. Anno is less measured and reassuring in his treatment of international relations than Ishiro Honda, but Shin Godzilla is not an outright contradiction or negation of the original film or the others that followed. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. I had a great time making it. I've certainly ranted about this subject plenty of times in the past, so it's something that really interests me. If you enjoyed this video, keep an eye out for more in the future, and if you want to support this and other projects I've got in the works, I'll be posting a Patreon along with my next video, which will be about the 3 seasons of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers and the seasons of Super Sentai that it's based on. Kind of a comparison, contrast, and review of all those series, so that should be fun. Keep an eye out for that. I'll see you guys next time.